great things about politicians is that they're predictably self-interested. And they're single-minded in their focus. And their focus is essentially to get re-elected. And that's why, over the last 15 years, say, politicians have got re-elected in New Zealand by becoming increasingly socially liberal. Because the New Zealand public understands the case for social liberalism. No one thinks it's a great argument to discriminate against homosexuals, that I just don't think homosexuality is normal or good or whatever. No one thinks that's a good argument, and that's why in the space of the last 15 years we've done things like, well, in the space of the last 25 years, legalise, undertaken homosexual law reform, allowed civil unions, legalised prostitution. But what the public doesn't understand, and therefore what politicians don't respond to, is a public understanding of economics. The public, for example, thought it was a great idea to get rid of youth minimum wages because it would mean that youth would start to get paid more. They didn't realise that it would lead to 12,000 young people being unemployed and unable to find a job. And that's why the case for a party that is dedicated towards social and economic liberalism must be to explain economics to a public who is otherwise ignorant of economics. So I want to talk about two things. I want to talk about essentially why the public is less aware of the costs of current government economic policy than they are of social policy. The second thing I want to talk about is special interest groups, and why special interest groups in the social area are consistent with the ACT Party's message surrounding social liberalism, but that special interest groups in the economic area are inconsistent with our messages surrounding economic liberalism. And lastly, I want to talk about how economic liberalism is a necessity for social liberalism in the first place. Okay. So let's start with why the public systematically misunderstands the role of economics and understands the case for social liberalism. Okay, let's start with social policy. So if you're advocating a position for gay adoption or like rules surrounding recreational use of drugs, if you're saying we should liberalise, say, marijuana, Clodagh made the point that there are small, concentrated groups who really believe in those things. So if you're a homosexual, it's really important to you that you marry the person whom you love. If you're homosexual, it's really important that you should be able to adopt a child. And that means that those particular interest groups form special interest groups who lobby very hard for changes to those policies. They demonstrate at Parliament, they undertake marches, they try and convince other people. And that means that there's always a very loud group of activists who are pushing very hard for social liberal policies. And we all understand the detriments of not giving people equal rights before the law. We know the consequence of not respecting homosexuals as full citizens. We know that not allowing people to adopt children on the basis of their sexuality is discriminatory, because the case for those things is particularly easy. But let's look in the economic sphere, because economics is quite complicated. But worse than that is a lot of people assume that businesses are in favour of the free market. They think that they love nothing more than the free market and free competition. But the case is actually the opposite. Businesses love nothing more than free competition for everyone else, provided that they get some kind of special government privilege. And the case made by people for special privileges in the area of economic policy is overwhelming. So take minor examples that have recently emerged, like the insistence by taxi operators that you should install a security camera in your car. Now, before the law change, all taxi operators were free to install a camera in their car if they wanted to. If they really thought it was such a valuable thing to do, free to do it. Go and do it. So why did they advocate for a law change? Well, they advocated for a law change to stop people who would otherwise, undertake a normal job throughout the rest of the week, and then, say a rugby test was on, would shove some stickers on their car and operate a taxi. Essentially, what they wanted to do was increase the barriers to entry of people into the taxi industry. Now, when taxi drivers said we need cameras in our cars, the public didn't sit back and go, why are they doing that? What's their interest here? Is it subtly to increase the amount that they can charge by dissuading the marginal person from entering and operating a taxi? Of course they didn't. They said, yeah, that sounds terrible. Someone died in a taxi, let's put cameras in them. And that's why the case for economic liberalism is harder, but needs to be fought much more, because we need the public to understand that. Just as we need the public to understand that the case for minimum wages isn't you increase the wages of people, because if that made sense, minimum wages would be infinitely high. The case against minimum wages is that if you increase the cost of employing various sectors of the economy, those people don't get employed. The case for the Employment Contracts Act is that by freeing up the labour market, you decrease the costs of hiring people and more people were hired. That's why the fastest period of employment growth in New Zealand were after 1991, rather than after the passage of the Employment Relations Act. And the case for economic liberalism is therefore much harder to make, but much more important to be made, because no one else makes that particular argument. The last point that I want to make relates to essentially the false dichotomy between these two values. Because the reality is unless you have a significant measure of economic liberalism, you will never have a significant aspect of social liberalism. Let's take the case of freedom of speech. Milton Friedman once said that the only people who have true freedom of speech in America are tenured professors who are about to retire. And thankfully Milton Friedman used that to his advantage. But the reality is when the government determines the particular economic outcomes that you suffer and face, your freedom in the social area is severely restricted. Take the case of Madeline Setchell, who was fired from working for the government because she went out with a National Party member. Now, I'm not saying going out with a National Party member isn't something that is to be regretted. I'm saying you shouldn't be fired for it. Equally, the case earlier this year when the government cut income to beneficiaries who criticised their policy, that is a case where the lack of economic liberalism operating in New Zealand meant that people's stances, people's freedom of speech was severely impacted. We all shouldn't have to be Milton Friedman in order to have free speech, and that's why economic freedom must come before social freedom.